Story 1, The Soldier's Last Waltz. In the small village where Lillian resided, the war seemed like a distant storm, its rumble only faintly touching the serene life of the countryside. The war had claimed many, sending young men to the front and leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables. Lillian had bid farewell to James, her childhood sweetheart, at this very station where she now stood, clutching a faded photograph. As she walked back to her home, Lillian reminisced about their final moments together. James, ever the optimist, had promised to return, and they'd planned their future with a hope that felt audacious under the circumstances. They would dance at their wedding, he'd said, to their favorite Vera Lynn song. Months turned into years, and the war dragged on, its conclusion nowhere in sight. Lillian maintained the home that she hoped they'd share, keeping everything just as James had left it. His letters were her solace, each one read and reread until she knew them by heart. The day the letters stopped coming, Lillian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. She tried to maintain her routine, visiting the post office daily, but the postmaster's apologetic shrug became a regular disappointment. Halloween night of 1943 brought an unsettling silence over the village. The usual celebrations were muted, the war had tempered even the children's desire for mischief and merriment. Lillian sat by the fire, the glow of the flames casting dancing shadows upon the walls. The sweater she held brought no comfort, its scent no longer holding the essence of James. When the knocks came, they were hesitant, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Lillian's heart leapt. There was a part of her, irrational though it may have been, that immediately thought of James. The rational part scolded her for such foolishness. Standing before her was a soldier, his uniform impeccable, his medals glinting in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds. But his face remained in shadow, and he did not speak. Lillian's voice trembled as she asked, "James?" But the soldier only offered his hand. As if compelled by a force beyond her understanding, Lillian took it. The room filled with the ghostly sound of "We'll meet again," though the gramophone had not been wound. They danced, each step perfectly in sync, as if they'd practiced for this moment all their lives. The war, the waiting, the sorrow, it all melted away. For hours they waltzed, the world reduced to the space within the hearth's glow. Lillian's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and a dread she couldn't place. It wasn't until the cold light of dawn crept through the windows that she noticed the chill of the hand that held hers. As the morning sun broke the horizon, the soldier's form grew faint. His features became clearer for a moment, and it was indeed James, but his eyes held a sorrow that was almost unbearable. He touched her cheek, and the sensation was like a whisper of wind before he vanished completely. The telegram came with the morning post, the words killed in action, a final blow to her already fragile heart. The dance, the music, the touch, it had all been James's way of saying goodbye, a last gift from the man she'd loved since she was a child. Lillian never moved from the house, nor did she marry. She would often speak of her last dance with James, a tale that the village children listened to with wide-eyed wonder. As for Lillian, she lived with the memory of that Halloween, forever cherishing the night when James had returned to her, if only to keep the promise of their last waltz. The years passed, and the war became a chapter in history books, but for Lillian, it remained a poignant part of her daily life. Every Halloween since that ethereal dance, she'd dress in the same gown that swirled around her ankles that night and wait by the fire, but the soldier never came again. Yet, in her heart, the dance never truly ended. The village grew. The fields where once young men toiled before being called to duty were now filled with new generations, unaware of the echoes of the past that lingered there. Children played and laughed, and life went on, but Lillian's home became a time capsule, a shrine to the love and loss of the war years. People in the village spoke of the old house with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Whispers among the townsfolk suggested that Lillian's home was haunted, not by a presence that rattled chains, but by a love so strong it transcended death itself. Some claimed to hear faint music coming from the house each Halloween, the melodic strains of a time long past. Lillian aged, her once youthful face reflecting the passage of time, but her spirit remained untouched by the bitterness that so often accompanies grief. She found solace in her garden, in the books she read by the fireside, and in the company of those few who appreciated her stories of the past. As Lillian entered the twilight of her life, her thoughts turned increasingly towards the day she would reunite with James. She had no fear of death, seeing it as a passage to that grand dance hall where James awaited her, ready to continue their waltz. On one particularly cold Halloween night, as the fire in the hearth struggled against the chill that crept through the cracks of the aging house, Lillian felt a sense of finality. She put on the gown, now fragile and worn, and sat in the chair by the fire, her eyes closing gently. The fire flickered and faded, and with it, Lillian's breath slowed. In the quiet of the house, a new sound emerged, the soft beginning of a beloved melody. It grew stronger, enveloping the room, wrapping around Lillian like a warm embrace. With a strength she hadn't felt in years, Lillian stood. Before her was James, just as he appeared that last Halloween, his hand outstretched, his eyes full of love and longing. "I've come to finish our dance, my love," he said, his voice like a melody itself. Lillian took his hand, and as they danced, the room disappeared, the walls giving way to a brilliant light that seemed to shine from within them. There was no war here, no pain, no waiting, only the dance, the love, and the promise of eternity. Back in the village, when they spoke of Lillian after she was found that November morning, peaceful as if in sleep, they'd say it was the love that kept her going all those years. And on Halloween, if you passed by the old house, you might still hear the sound of two lovers waltzing in the world beyond this one, their footsteps a testament to a love that even war could not end. Story 2, The Jazz of the Haunted Heart. New Orleans, 1942, a city where the pulse of jazz was the heartbeat of the night. Street corners echoed with the brass of trumpets and the melancholy wail of the saxophone. But amidst this orchestra of the streets, there was one jazz bar that held a different kind of melody, one that spoke of the unseen. Eleanor, a young woman with the spirit of the flappers and the curiosity of a cat, had moved to New Orleans in the wake of a life looking for a fresh start. She found work at the Velvet Note, a jazz bar with a sultry ambience and a reputation for the otherworldly. It was said that the bar was home to the ghost of a musician who loved jazz so much, he refused to let death steal him from the embrace of its rhythms. Every night, Eleanor worked the floor, serving drinks and swaying to the rhythms, and she noticed an odd patron. He was always there, in the same corner booth, nursing the same drink, his gaze lost in the fervor of the music. He was an anachronism, his suit a style from years ago, and his eyes holding stories that were out of place in the joy of the bar. The man never spoke to anyone, and no one ever seemed to speak to him. Eleanor's curiosity grew with each passing night. One evening, mustering her courage, she approached him. But just as she neared, the air grew cold, and a shiver danced down her spine. The man's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a longing that was as deep as the river that flowed by the city. "Would you like another drink?" she asked, her voice nearly lost in the cacophony of the bar. The man simply shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. Eleanor turned to leave but stopped. "Why do you come here every night?" she asked, her voice a whisper against the trumpets. "To remember," he replied, his voice a distant echo. Night after night, Eleanor watched the man, and as days turned into weeks, she started to feel a presence watching her as she made her way home through the lamplit streets. The feeling grew stronger until one night, walking home, she heard footsteps trailing hers. Turning, she saw nothing but the fog rolling in from the Mississippi. The next day, a regular at the bar, an old saxophonist with eyes that had seen the birth of jazz, pulled her aside. "That man you talk to," he began, "they say he was a musician, died in a brawl over a love gone sour, right where you're standing." Eleanor's blood ran cold. That night, as she prepared to leave, she felt the now familiar sensation of being followed. She quickened her pace, the click of her heels a staccato accompaniment to the racing of her heart. As she approached her door, she turned once more to see the man from the bar, his figure barely visible in the mist. She confronted him. "Why do you follow me?" "Because you hear the music, not just with your ears, but with your heart," he said. "And that's where I reside now, in the jazz of the haunted heart." Eleanor, though fearful, felt a strange compassion for the spectre before her. Over time, their encounters grew into an understanding. She learned his story, how his passion for jazz was only matched by his love for a woman who betrayed him, leading to his untimely end. The man's ghost found solace in Eleanor's attention, and as the seasons changed, so did the nature of their interactions. Eleanor would leave the back door of the Velvet Note ajar, and the ghostly musician would fill the bar with melodies from a piano that no one else could play. The patrons spoke of the magic in the air, of the jazz that seemed to come from the very soul of New Orleans itself. As the nights went by, Eleanor found herself drawn deeper into the world that the ghostly musician inhabited. The Velvet Note became a place of refuge not just for her, but for the lost spirit that had found a friend in the living. The haunting music that flowed from the unseen piano player drew crowds that whispered rumors of the haunted jazz bar with the best music in town. But with the spectral attention came an unnerving sensation that Eleanor couldn't shake off. It was as if the musician's spirit was growing stronger, his presence more pronounced each passing night. Patrons started to report seeing a figure in the corner of their eyes, a shadowy outline that vanished when looked at directly. Eleanor felt a growing concern. One night, she decided to confront the spirit. "You belong to another time," she said, "the bar empty and the moon casting long shadows through the windows. Why cling to this place?" The air stirred as the ghost seemed to ponder her words. "This place is my unfinished symphony," he replied, his voice a haunting melody. "I can't leave until the last note is played." She nodded, understanding the passion that drove artists, the need for closure. Eleanor vowed to help him find that final note to complete his symphony. She pored over old records, researched the history of the bar, and spoke to older residents about the musician's life. After weeks of investigation, she unearthed a tragic tale of love and jealousy that ended in a violent confrontation, one that left the musician dead and his lover vanished into the night. The musician's final piece, a tribute to his lost love, had never been performed. Determined to help, Eleanor arranged a special night at the Velvet Note. She invited the oldest and most faithful patrons, those who knew the ghost's story, and announced that they would witness a once-in-a-lifetime performance. The bar was silent as Eleanor took the stage. "Tonight, we help a soul find peace," she declared and began to play the musician's final piece on the piano. The notes were sad but beautiful, filled with the pain of loss and the hope of forgiveness. As she played, the temperature dropped, and a figure materialized at the piano beside her. The ghostly musician's hands moved with hers, his presence solidifying with each note. The crowd watched in awe as the duet unfolded, a blend of life and afterlife in perfect harmony. When the piece ended, a heavy silence filled the bar, laden with emotion. Then, applause erupted, not just from the patrons, but from the spirit as well. Eleanor looked to see the musician's ghost, smiling at her, his figure starting to fade. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice fading with his form. "I can rest now." As his presence dissipated, the bar seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The Velvet Note had been a home to the ghost for too long, and now it was finally free. The ghost's story became legend, the tale of the haunted jazz bar where, for one night, the living and the dead played a symphony of closure. Eleanor continued to work at the bar, but the eerie occurrences ceased. The velvet note thrived, the patrons always requesting the piece that set the musician's spirit free, and Eleanor would oblige, playing the haunting melody that once bridged two worlds. The ghost was never seen again, but his music lived on, a testament to the enduring power of jazz and the human heart's capacity to heal the most tormented of souls. Story 3, The Haunting of Wyndham House. In the heart of Virginia, where the forests whisper ancient secrets and the hills hold on to the echoes of the past, there lies a mansion known as the Wyndham House. It stood as a silent sentinel, its grandeur fading with time, its walls keeping the memories of centuries. The tales that clung to the old house spoke of sorrow and the restless spirits that refused to depart. It was the summer of 1943, and the war had taken its toll on the people. Among them was a young writer named Charlotte, whose heart ached with the weight of loss. Her husband, a soldier, had gone missing in action, leaving her to wrestle with the uncertainty of his fate. Seeking solitude and a place to nurse her broken heart, Charlotte rented Wyndham House, unaware of the shadows that danced in its halls. The first night was unsettling. The house creaked and groaned as though lamenting its own decay. Charlotte attributed the noises to the natural settling of an old structure, but as the hours waned, the sense of being watched grew stronger. She tried to convince herself that it was the isolation playing tricks on her mind. Days passed, and the feeling of unease grew. Charlotte would find items misplaced, hear whispers in the dead of night, and see fleeting shadows from the corner of her eye. The locals spoke of the house's history, of a family that once lived there, their lives tragically cut short during the previous war. It was said their spirits lingered, unable to move on. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Charlotte began to research the history of the Wyndham family. She learned of their love for the house and the tragedy that befell them when the patriarch was killed in battle. In her heart, she felt a kinship with the Wyndham matriarch, a woman who had waited for her husband, only to receive a folded flag. One night, as the storm raged outside, the power in the house failed. With only candlelight to guide her, Charlotte felt her way through the dark corridors. That's when she saw her, the ghost of Mrs. Wyndham, in a dress of a bygone era, her expression one of deep sorrow. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The ghost didn't speak but simply gazed out of the rain-streaked window. Compelled by a desire to help, Charlotte approached her, and the ghost turned to look at her, eyes filled with a silent plea. Over the following weeks, Charlotte and the spirit of Mrs. Wyndham reached an unspoken understanding. The ghost would not startle her, and in return, Charlotte would continue to learn about the family, documenting their history, ensuring they would not be forgotten. As she delved deeper into their story, she uncovered love letters between Mr. and Mrs. Wyndham. The depth of their affection was palpable, and Charlotte would read them aloud to the ghostly matron, who listened with a wistful gaze. Then, one unremarkable day, as the sun bathed the house in a warm light, Charlotte came across a letter she hadn't seen before. It was the last letter Mr. Wyndham had written to his wife, filled with hope and longing for a future they would never have. As Charlotte read the words, she felt the weight of the presence behind her. She turned to see Mrs. Wyndham, her spectral form clearer than ever, tears streaming down her translucent cheeks. The ghost reached out, her hand touching the letter, and in that moment, the room filled with a bright light. When Charlotte's eyes adjusted, she was alone. She rushed to the window and saw, for the first time, the gardens in full bloom, as if the house had shed its sorrow and was breathing anew. In the days that followed, the house was peaceful. The whispers had ceased, the shadows gone. It seemed as though the Wyndhams had found their peace, their love transcending the boundaries of life and death. Charlotte finished her book, a tribute to the house and its former inhabitants. As she prepared to leave Wyndham House, she knew she would never forget the haunting beauty, and the spectral love story that had unfolded within these walls. The mansion had given her a sense of closure, a hope that perhaps her own story might yet have a happy ending.